You are listening to Influencers from the Conference Board.
Welcome to Influencers. I'm Craig Carroll, Communications Institute leader here at the Conference Board. And today I'm speaking with my colleagues, Lisa Davis, who is Senior Counselor with the Walker Marchant Group, former Corporate Vice President for Communications and Worldwide Executive Team member at Northrop Grumman, and Steve Dowling, former VP of Communications for Apple and former Silicon Valley Bureau Chief for CNBC. And our topic today is the COVID-19, the crisis communications response. The coronavirus is the biggest story in the world, with major outbreaks in China, in Europe, and the Middle East, with government authorities over-responding in some cases and under-responding in other cases, mixing politics and public health. Additional chaos and confusion is created among citizens, countries, and companies alike. Misinformation and confusion about the coronavirus is spreading at faster rates than the virus itself. Cities are enacting mass quarantines and limiting the size of public gatherings. Travel bans are leaving companies short of labor and short of parts, and further creating social, political, and economic risks. The stock market just took the single biggest one-day hit since the 2008 economic decline, and the coronavirus outbreak has sparked an overwhelming amount of information on social media and websites, amounting to what the World Health Organization is calling an infodemic, leaving many to wonder exactly how should companies respond. Well, over the years, the Conference Board has looked at communications responses of similar events, such as the SARS epidemic. Unfortunately, these events are not challenging us too frequently. But the question now is, what can companies and their stakeholders expect as these unprecedented events unfold today? And how should companies think about their communication responses in terms of their stakeholders and their communities, and in particular their employees and their supply chain as the world watches? Lisa, we'll go to you first. How should companies be thinking about their communication efforts tied to the coronavirus outbreak?
Well, first, Craig, I'd like to say hi to you and Steve. It's really a pleasure to be on this program talking about such a critical issue. I appreciate the invitation. Going directly to your question, the company response needs to take into account the human response. What do I mean by that? Whether it's supply chain, manufacturing, production, any aspect of the business and the business partners, it's all driven by people. And you better believe that they're all going to be thinking about response in a way that is personal. So understanding that as we continue to pull through, what needs to be done in the business will be critical. And unfortunately, I think we find that a lot of organizations don't necessarily do that.
Okay.
Facts are important, but in issues like this, they change all the time. What's known on day 2 is not going to be the same on day 22. So you have to stay on top of the facts, but also continue that constant communication because it is going to change. The last thing I would say about this is that companies have to stay true to their values. The facts are changed, their values should not. And their response ought to go through the prism of who they are as a company in the best possible way.
Oh, that's fantastic. Steve, what are your thoughts on this? What would you add to this scenario?
Yeah, hi, Craig, and thanks. I agree with everything that Lisa said. I think it's really important. Usually when we think about crisis communications, the crisis centers on an individual, a company, a group, maybe a whole industry. The communications team tries to be strategic. They're managing information to their advantage, but the coronavirus is a global health crisis. Mm-hmm. So we need to recognize that we're all in this together, mm-hmm. and the impact that you might be seeing in your corner of the world has implications for a much wider segment of the population. Mm-hmm. As communicators, we need to advocate for more transparency and perhaps go out of our comfort zone when it comes to the kind of information, the volume of information that we release. I agree with what Lisa said, and we've got to keep in mind news about one company is also a data point for people who are trying to make informed decisions in a crisis. And that should make us more comfortable in being transparent and should also caution us to stick to the facts.
Okay, that's good. Now, so in this era of hyper transparency, right, and an issue where people are looking for more information and they're sorting through the amounts of information that's out there. Some of it is mixed and some of it is just, factually untrue. What exactly are some of the things that companies need to be communicating right now?
Well, we can look at things that we should be communicating out of responsibility, and then things that might be useful or helpful. Something that's going to impact your employees or your customers, disruption of service, for example. You've got a responsibility to communicate that, and you've got to communicate it responsibly. You want to be thorough and factual. You want to avoid making a bad situation worse. And it's important to keep people up to date on the steps you're taking to protect your employees or your customers. The coronavirus is so high profile. There's so much information coming at people. When it comes to what you're communicating, you've got to make sure that it's accurate and authoritative. So you kind of got to stay in your lane. The most helpful thing, you can do is, report what you know firsthand. You've seen it or you're doing it in your organization. And you make sure you run that to ground before you're releasing it.
Okay. Now, what do you mean by stay in your lane in this case? What does that look like for companies?
Well, I think you want to understand, what are you an authority on? You're an authority on things that happen within your community, your business, your people, decisions that your company is making. You don't want to be giving out information that you're not an authority on. You're dealing with, people's health. This is, really sensitive and really important. People want information from the experts. They need confidence.
Okay.
The information they get has got to be authoritative. So again, you've got to be absolutely sure what you're sharing is accurate. And if you are relaying information, let's say, about precautions you're taking at the workplace or in your business, tell people, what you base that decision on. Are you following the recommendations of a government agency, the CDC, or the World Health Organization, things of that nature? Okay.
Lisa, what would you add? What would you say are some of the things in addition to what Steve's offered here?
Well, there is a lot of information, and I agree with Steve wholeheartedly. There are a whole lot of sources out there. And having the organization or the company speak to directly what impacts their employees and their business is the number one role. They can link to, the World Health Organization or NIH. Both have been very vocal on this whole issue. So they want to make sure that there's confidence and people know exactly who they can go to for what when it comes to the business and what their role is. So I think that is the probably number one or the key thing, because it's easy to get sidetracked. And then people start thinking that you're the answer man or woman, or your company's the answer man or woman for any and everything.
Okay. So, Lisa, let me follow that up with another question. What would you say that companies should not be communicating right now?
I think those two are twinned.
Okay.
I think they should not be communicating about things, to Steve's point, that they don't have that they're not the experts in.
Okay.
They should not be communicating things that may put them in a difficult, legalistic position or have them take responsibility. Because a lot of people want to speculate. And I've had this conversation very recently with someone with another large organization. When it comes to, publicly traded companies, there's materiality.
Right. So,
and you have to think about what you can and cannot say and how you should say it. And realize that just because we're going through a situation that hasn't happened before at this magnitude doesn't mean that all the rules are off.
So, Lisa, I want to carry on a little bit with Steve's observation about transparency, and that is that companies should be staying in their lane. They should not be speaking out on things that they're not an authority on, and yet companies will still have audiences, employees, or other groups that are expecting information from them. But and you want to avoid the appearance of stonewalling. But how do you handle this issue of silence? What does silence look like, and how do you convey no information or your decision to be quiet on certain aspects in a way that still satisfies employees' desire for transparency? Lisa, what are your thoughts?
The easiest way to do it is to respond by telling them exactly why you can't answer the question.
Okay. All right. Steve, any other thoughts on that? On what companies should not be communicating?
I agree. You've got to be honest with your audiences here. And if there's a data point that you don't have, if there's information that you're not an authority on, that you've got to ideally refer people to the right source for that type of information. Companies can be a resource for their employees, for their customers, whoever their audience is. And I would go back to what Lisa said at the outset. This got to be a very human response, and we've got to recognize that in a situation like this, that's a crisis, a public health crisis. People are really going to be looking for information, and they're going to need it to be authoritative. And so, if you're not answering a question, I think it's also our responsibility to challenge ourselves and the people we work with as to why we're not answering that question.
Okay.
If we don't know the answer, that's a good reason, but hopefully there is someplace that we can point people or a resource that we can, agree to trust, that will come in useful.
Okay. So, Steve, let me follow up with another question, right? So, you just mentioned trust here. What are the types of outcomes that companies should be looking toward achieving right now through the communication efforts tied to the COVID-19 virus?
Oh, I think communications right now needs to be about helping people through the crisis. Yeah. Anything that you're doing on behalf of your employees or your customers, that can be useful information, assuming companies are doing the right thing, which we hope they are, in helping protect people. That can be reassuring. But right now, we don't know where this is going to take us, and we're all on this journey, if you will, together. And so we've just got to recognize that as communicators, and understand, where our audience is coming from in their demand, their need for information, and we've got to try to help satisfy that.
Okay, Lisa, what are your thoughts? What are some outcomes that you think companies should be looking to achieve right now through their efforts?
Yes, over the years, I've seen research that says a reputation and the relationship that customers or individuals want to have with a company is really based on three things. One is the goods and services that are provided. So the response with that would be you want to minimize disruptions. The second most powerful one is integrity. Is there strong leadership? Is there honest and transparent leadership? Do we feel good about what this company is telling us because we've seen that they walk the talk and talk the walk consistently? And you want to make sure that that happens in these kind of crises. The third thing is compassion. How you treat your employees, how you treat the community, how are you engaged? Those are the big three areas around which people make decisions about whether to engage your business or not.
Okay.
And in this crisis, and in your question, those are the three outcomes that you want, that you advance smoothly through all of those.
So I'm going to push on the leadership one here for a question, because when I see some of the responses that are coming from not necessarily companies, but third parties and some government leaders around the world, where they're positioning for leadership, it leads to them speaking out on things that they're not an authority on, or even holding back on information that they have because they want to preserve the appearance of integrity or the appearance of leadership. How can companies respond? I would say particularly the ones that are leading communications in an environment where they're dealing with other parties, some that are credible sources of information, and others that are simply jockeying for leadership in this moment. Lisa, how do you think companies should be responding in a situation like this?
I'm going to go back to what Steve said that I wholeheartedly agree with. Stay in your lane.
Okay.
Don't get pulled into because there's a lot of heat and light that comes with an emotional issue like a health crisis.
Mm-hmm. Steve, jump in.
Yeah, no, I think that another thing to think about is that there's a bit of I think you started to get to this, Craig, there's a bit of a tension here between, do we want to talk about this? Maybe there's a natural sort of inclination to not talk about these things. It reminded me that there was some reporting here in the Bay Area recently on social media, but I have no doubt that it was accurate that the companies were considering, mandating that everyone work from home, but no company wanted to be the first one to take that step.
Right.
Now, I don't know if that's true, but companies need to set aside those kinds of concerns about optics in a health crisis if they're confident that they're making reasonable and good decisions. If there's a penalty for being overcautious, it's got to pale in comparison to the penalty for not doing enough. So I think just the first principle here is we've got to make sure that we're doing the right thing, keeping people's needs in mind, and then communicating accordingly.
Okay. So in this area of doing the right thing, and how do you handle situations where you have employees who have fears or uncertainties about whether or not their colleagues who have just been traveling might have the virus? How do you deal with speculation in the workplace? Steve, how do you think companies should be dealing with this in a way of being having a focus on health and looking out for everyone, but at the same time reducing uncertainties?
Yeah, well, I think number one, we've also got to remember through all of this that we're dealing with health, a public health issue, but it all comes down to individuals' health, and we need to be very sensitive to people's privacy through that, of course. But I think the situation that you described about people being nervous, and certainly we've seen that in many parts of the world, in many different forms during this crisis already, more information, I think, is going to or should win out over less information. Because if you think about it, in a crisis where people are not sure, their worst fears are going to fill that void. And in general, I think, for most cases anyway, the truth, the facts are probably not as bad as the worst, what people fear.
Okay.
I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. But the other thing is that when you put out information, factual, solid information that you're confident on, hopefully one of the impacts is that it gives people sort of a stopping point for those fears, and they don't spiral out of control. The news may be bad, but at least we know what the facts are, and we can work with those. Okay.
So, Steve, how do we accomplish this? How are companies to go about these things, right, in accomplishing these outcomes?
Well, I'd focus again on the fact that coronavirus has a potential to impact everyone on Earth, directly, or indirectly. And it's about people's health, people's lives. So the economic impact, the impact that a company is probably seeing, is really secondary to all of those considerations. People need to come first, as Lisa said at the beginning. And when companies are making decisions and when we're communicating about those decisions. So I would say that if we've got to lead with making the right decisions on behalf of people, and then let that be the starting point for that communications mechanism.
Lisa, what are your thoughts on this? In particular, I'm wondering, how do top leaders deal with all the aspects of this as a public health crisis? Right? I mean, there's also aspects that are tied to HR and personal health, community health, and so on. How do companies, or how do the communicators here in this particular aspect deal with these issues? How do they go about accomplishing these goals?
And I think I'm going to expound on what you just talked about a little bit. Communications have to be twinned with action.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real problem when organizations try to divorce the two. Mm-hmm. Somehow they can just put the pretty words out there and not have to think about how we truly respond. And that calls for a high-level response team that should be in place that, to your point, includes HR. It includes, business leaders, communications. It includes IT, and others who are going to be responsible for determining the action. Steve just mentioned what happened out in California, where there was, no company wanted to go first in terms of letting employees work from home. And now, globally, that's happening a lot. I had a conversation. There's a large company out there who went to that response, allowing people who were working in one of the foreign hotspots to work from home. You know what happened? The computer system crashed.
Oh, wow.
Because it had not been prepared for that many employees all at the same time for long periods of time. So if you're going to communicate and come up with a policy, you have to make sure that you've got a team together that's kind of worked through the implications and what needs to happen such that those policies can work out. And to Steve's point, absolutely, people first. People first. So if it's the right thing to do to let people work from home if you're in a hot spot, or the government, as we've seen in in Asia have closed schools and businesses and told people to stay in. You don't have much of a option when you're facing those kind of situations. And it's also the right thing to do if people have, possibility of infection spreading. But then you have to make sure that you have the right systems in place so that actually can happen.
Yeah.
Because the last thing I'll say about this is you don't understand, like, if you announce something and it goes bad, that's a trust deficit. And people are going to remember that as you continue to communicate and make decisions.
Yeah. I like your point that it's more than just simply making announcements, right? That there's other aspects, right? There's the touch points in dealing with HR. I think that's one question I'd like to explore a little bit. Like, what are some of the things here that companies or the top communications person needs to be doing besides just simply thinking about getting the message out, right? So part of it is working with the rest of the senior leadership team on getting clarity on what it is that what the response should be and what their priorities should be. It's also connecting with HR and IT and connecting the dots and other aspects. But are there any other things that you can think of that these senior leaders need to be doing that might be outside of their traditional day-to-day routines right now, where a crisis like this presents an opportunity for helping to develop clarity and coherence for the community as a whole? I mean, what community, I'm referring to the organization as a community and recognizing, the group of people together as a body. Elisa, well, what are your thoughts? What would you add?
Sure. There's nothing like preparation to help an organization be prepared.
Yeah.
The role of communicator, there should be in place crisis response plans and processes, and even doing scenarios ahead of a crisis, because that identifies what the communications chain is going to be, what the decision chain is going to be, who has responsibility for what. And while you're not going to be able to, role play a scenario, every last thing that could ever happen, if you have your CEO or COO, your head of HR, your head of communications, your head of IT, your head of aspect of the business, operations, and security, by the way, and they all understand and are drilled on how to respond and how to make these decisions and what some of the decisions are that they need to think about in advance. It helps so much, and communications can lead that effort.
Okay. Steve, what are your thoughts on this in terms of
I agree.
With the top management team? Yeah, go on.
Well, no, I agree, and I think that the communications lead has got to make sure that they are really at the center of all of that activity. They've got to be the information hub, and you need to insist on direct access to the people who are providing the information. You don't want to be in some sort of information chain where there's 3 stops before it gets to you, and each person, maybe it's human nature, might be trying to make it sound a little better than it actually is. You need that direct access, and you need to be able to be confident yourself that what you're getting is the straight story before you relay it, and then feed it back to people so that they can verify it. I think the most important thing here, just as we talked about transparency at the top of the show, transparency in each of those communications internally is really important. And ideally, you've got complete transparency, so you're dealing with facts that then you can relay to whatever your audience is. Okay.
Now, Steve, just carrying on with that, what are some of the challenges that you see, right, in all of these aspects, whether it's working with the senior leadership team, working with the other unit heads, connecting the dots, trying to anticipate what's coming down the pipeline? What are some of the challenges here that companies, I'll say leaders in this particular case, may face when they try to enact some of these aspects, when companies are many times often used to the communicators just being the ones to announce, right? But this is certainly an opportunity to step up and to exhibit leadership here. So what are some challenges that people will face when they're leading communications in this area?
Well, I think the challenge is, like in a lot of situations, is that sometimes you have to be the bearer of what people consider bad news. You've got to be delivering information that people may not like to hear. We're in a crisis. And that can be tough, I think, for people who are communications professionals, certainly for people who are not communications professionals. Nobody likes to deliver news that people aren't going to like to hear, or that might concern them, scare them. And there's plenty of that going on right now with this story. So I think that just as you want to be at the center of that information hub, getting direct access to people, so that you can be confident that you're getting the straight story, you want to also take it upon yourself to relay, unvarnished, the information that should be going back to those people, and how things are being reported, what the developments are, other data points that are out there that may be connected with what you're announcing. Those things you need to be very direct about, because a lot of times in these situations, if you're not, you don't know who is.
Yeah.
And that's really critical as far as the decisions that you're going to make, communications and other aspects of dealing with a health crisis.
Yeah. Now, Lisa, you mentioned that it should be the coupling of communications and action here. So what are some challenges that you see for communicators as leaders in this particular context?
There's 4. I'll call it the magic 4. The first is implementation.
Okay.
It's easy for people to sit around in a room and decide something, but implementation. The second one is setting precedent. Because what happens, a lot of people think about what happens in a company at a time like this, where there's a crisis, there's going to be a tail on that. Is this setting a new precedent? The third is coordination. This is directly to Steve's point. There are a lot of people that need to be coordinated with inside and outside of an organization.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be a challenge. The fourth is the speed at which news and information travels.
Mm-hmm.
Fake or real. And so the cycle, trying to stay ahead of the cycle is impossible.
Right.
So you've got to kind of figure out what the right cadence is for you and your company. The one thing I would probably just add is the high-level group. I'm assuming there's a response group. There had to be in the business, because to accomplish the things that we just talked about, there's got to be a convened high-level group that's making decisions, as well as helping frame up the communications. But there's also the question of, what does success look like for the company in a way that there's common agreement for it. And to kind of to put that as an almost North Star when you start the conversation, because there's a lot of things that can be done. Yeah. What's the most helpful? What are the most helpful ones and the priorities? And then what will select success look like? Because there's going to be criticism for days.
Yeah.
When this is tailing off.
Oh, that's great. I think it's also important, right, that we think about in these situations here that we celebrate the small wins, right? The gratitude or the things that go well that often go unappreciated when you're in a crisis. You're running from moment to moment, trying to put out fires, right? That you take a moment to reflect and think, there's some things here that we did well. Okay, we're going to stop there. This has been a great conversation with Lisa Davis, Senior Counselor with the Walker Marchant Group and former Corporate Vice President for Communications and Worldwide Executive Team Member at Northrop Grumman, and Steve Dowling, former Vice President for Communications for Apple and former Silicon Valley Bureau Chief for CNBC, about companies' desired communication responses to the novel coronavirus outbreak. We've learned a lot. Lisa, Steve, thanks for joining us. And thanks to all of you for listening. If you like this content, please subscribe to Influencers. You can find this program and several others from the Conference Board on a wide variety of topics at conference-board.org/podcasts on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and many others. Thanks again for listening. I'm Craig Carroll, Communications Institute Leader with the Conference Board.
This has been Influencers from the Conference Board.